All right. Hi, everyone. And thanks for joining us today for today's Planning Your Summer Opportunity Workshop with Financial Wellness at Penn. So today we're going to be discussing how you can budget for your summer, whether you have an internship, a research experience, or otherwise. So my name is Lindsay Bertram, and I am the Financial Wellness Program Manager. I am also a Penn alum. I graduated in 2019. And yeah, I'm really excited to talk to you about budgeting today.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in here. Hi, everyone. My name is Jamil. I'm a junior in Wharton, and I'm a peer educator at the Financial Wellness at Penn program. And yeah, also excited for the conversation today.
Nice, great. So before we talk about actual budgeting, I just want to tell you a little bit about our program. So Financial Wellness at Penn is a program that intends to help students understand how to manage their personal finances, not only now, but also in the future. Our full mission statement is on the screen. You can read through that. I do want to give a brief disclaimer that, given that our mission is education-based, it's really important for us to acknowledge that financial education does not solve all money struggles. We try to be really intentional about this. Financial education doesn't fix poverty. It doesn't repair damage caused by years of economic injustice. When I was a student at Penn, I identified as first generation low income. I budgeted on a weekly basis. I checked my credit regularly. I did all the things you're supposed to do, but that didn't make me less poor. So I want to be really intentional in mentioning that what we can do today is help you understand the basics of personal finance and understand the options that are available to you. That's really what we can do with financial education. We want to help empower you with this education to make the decisions that are best for you when the time comes. So with that disclaimer out of the way, we're going to move on to today's presentation. So we like to start all of our workshops by outlining what we hope to accomplish during our time together. So we're going to begin today's workshop with a conversation about budgeting, because budgeting is the primary way that you can adequately plan for your summer experience. Our hope is that you leave today feeling confident about your summer financial plan. So today's goals are to help you become familiar with key budgeting concepts, understand why budgeting for the summer is unique from budgeting during the academic year, and then give you some tools to help you budget. We'll also have some time for you to do some practice later in the presentation. We have a short, really basic budget template that you can fill out throughout the presentation. I'm going to ask Jamil to drop the link to that in the chat now. Yeah, you can go ahead and follow that. Feel free to fill it out throughout the presentation as we're sort of talking about these steps. Or you can also wait. We'll pause for about 5 minutes at the end so that you can go through that and send any questions that you have. And if you do have questions before we reach the Q&A at the end, you can send them in the chat, whether in like the chat to everyone or to me or Jamil directly. And we will address those as they come up if they're like really important at that moment. So please feel free to do that as well. Okay, so before we jump in, I would love it if you all would use the chat to answer the question on the slide. How does budgeting make you feel? What words or feelings come to mind when you think about budgeting? And I'll just pause for 30 seconds or so you all can send in your thoughts. Plan for rainy days. Good point. Hope that things will come out right. That's big mood there. Really hope that it comes out right. Any other thoughts about how budgeting makes you feel or what comes to mind? Okay, Cool. Well, I'm going to hand it over to Jamil to talk about feelings around budgeting.
Yeah, thank you, Lindsay. So I want to begin by setting the tone around general budgeting. We know that budgeting can feel intimidating and overwhelming, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. We also commonly hear from students that they feel intimidated by budgeting because they're not math minded. Well, we're here to tell you that managing your personal finances is more about your behavior than it is about actual dollars and cents. So you don't need to be a math genius really to get your finances in order. And lastly, how you spend your money is really just linked to your values, beliefs, and priorities. There are all kinds of recommendations for how you could be budgeting, but no one could really tell you what's right for you because only you can decide that. So what is a budget? To put it simply, a budget is a plan for your income and expenses. It doesn't need to be more complicated than that. It's a reflection of your priorities within your current financial reality. And budgeting is helpful for a lot of reasons. It can help you achieve a specific financial goal. Budgeting is also a tool to help you understand your current relationship with money. And lastly, budgeting can help you cut costs and save money if that's something you want to do. There are probably many more reasons for why you may be budgeting or why budgeting is important, but these are just a few common reasons we wanted to highlight for you today. And aside from general budgeting, it can be crucial to budget specifically for special occasions where your spending and earning may be atypical compared to your regular budget. And budgeting for an internship is a great example of this because you'll be away from campus, most likely, if you're not on campus doing research or anything like that, possibly in a new city, and you'll have different priorities at that time than you would, during the academic year. So a lot can really change within your budget to reflect those differences. Are there any questions just before I walk through how we approach budgeting from a journal standpoint? Okay, cool. So no matter what you're budgeting for, we believe that all budgeting involves the standard 6-step process. We're going to briefly explain how this process works, and then we'll spend the rest of our time detailing what this process may look like for you, depending on what your summer situation looks like. So step 1 is to track your income and expenses for a month. Generally, this step helps you get a sense of what your regular income and expenses look like. And this way, you have a framework in which you can then base your future budgeting off of. Step 2 is to identify budget categories. Again, this goes back to creating a framework in which you situate your budget. So how would you organize your typical spending habits? How can you lump some of your habits together? Your categories may include things like school supplies, healthcare, food, entertainment, personal care items, toiletries, all the like. And it doesn't matter what these categories are, but it's helpful to have some idea so you can conceptualize your habits. Step 3 is to identify your income sources. So typically this involves any wages that you're earning through a job, any financial refund you may receive from PEN, gifts or allowances from families, or even withdrawals you may make from your savings account if you have them. And this just helps to identify the limits of your spending, which brings us to step 4, which is identifying your typical expenses. So we find it helpful to break this into fixed and variable expenses. Fixed expenses are ones that you incur of a standard amount and regular intervals. So things like rent, subscription fees, the like. And variable expenses are ones that you incur based on behavior or different things that are going on. So like food, entertainment, different social costs, maybe toiletries, depending on your current situation. Step 5 is an optional one, and it's really just to create boundaries around your spending. So we'd like to highlight that this step is optional because some folks prefer to set restrictions for how much they spend in certain categories, whereas others just like to know or just like to have a total amount of money that they spend and don't have to worry about the category breakdown as long as it's within, you know, their financial obligations or their financial means. Again, this really is just going to come down to you and your individual budgeting goals. So you really can decide if boundaries are needed for you in your budgeting exercise. And then lastly, step 6 is to reflect regularly and adjust as needed. Budgeting is usually not a one-time occurrence, and instead it's something you practice and adapt over time as your needs and wants change. So this can help you stay aware of your financial habits and, you know, just make the necessary changes as needed. Now that you understand the typical budgeting process, let's talk about what it may look like as you're preparing for your summer. And I'll pass it back to Lindsay for that.
Great. Thanks, Jamil. So today we're going to break our conversation into 2 parts because all of you are probably in varying positions when it comes to your plans for the summer. So I'm actually going to quickly launch a quick poll just to see, you know, what sort of situation you have for the summer. So what type of summer opportunity do you have? Are you still searching, paid, unpaid, whatever it is? And I see a question in the chat. How do you budget for expenses that are vague or haven't had before, such as furnishing an apartment or down payment for a lease? These are great questions. And I think we'll come to them when we come to the estimating expenses category. If we still haven't addressed it at that point, feel free to just bump this question in the chat again and we can discuss it in more detail then. Okay, it looks like nearly everyone has responded. So mostly still searching, which many folks are certainly in at this point. When I was a student, I don't think I ever had anything figured out by this point in the year. But I also was more of a last minute planner. So, okay, a few of you have paid and one of you has explicitly unpaid or underpaid. Okay, that's really helpful to know. Thank you for that. Okay, so again, this is just showing you guys may be in, you know, varying different situations as you're planning for the summer. So if you have a paid opportunity, that's fantastic and may make things a little easier for you or at least feel a little less stressful. And some of you may have an unpaid opportunity. So you may be in the process of applying for funding right now, or maybe you've already applied. We'll take some time to discuss how you can prepare no matter which situation you're in. And again, like I just said, if you have more questions throughout and more specific questions, send them in the chat. If you want to ask them privately, you can send a direct message, and we won't share your name or who asked or anything. So if you have a paid internship, really your goal is to look at the amount of money that you'll receive this summer, and determine if it's enough based on your needs. So if it's enough, then you need to determine, you know, what steps you need to take to successfully manage that money throughout the summer, whether you're paid hourly or you're receiving a stipend, whatever the case is, you'll want to have some plan for how to manage that throughout the course of the summer. It could also be the case that you determine that amount is not enough. And so then your goal would be to determine how much more money you need. Largely using a lot of the strategies we'll talk about for folks who have unpaid opportunities. So that being said, if you find yourself with an unpaid or underpaid summer experience, you actually have a lot of options. Penn offers a lot of resources for students in that situation. And we'll talk about some of the larger funding options that exist at Penn. They do all tend to require some form of a mock budget that you submit so that you can demonstrate, you know, why do you need as much as you need, as much as you're requesting. So our goal today is to help you understand how to make those estimates, like the question that was just asked in the chat, right? Like if you've never experienced them before, how can you be expected to know how much you should spend throughout the summer? So we're going to walk back through that 6-step process pretty slowly just to discuss, you know, how these steps look different based on your prospects for the summer. Give me 1 second to mute myself. Something. Hello again. So sorry for that. It's always great when you're in the middle of a presentation and then your doorbell rings, right? So someone may be walking behind me very shortly. We're just going to ignore that. Okay, so when you're planning for the future rather than the moment you're currently in, you may actually combine steps 1 and 2 that we discussed before. So again, this is tracking your income and identifying your budget categories. So what you want to do is you want to track your income and expenses, and basically what that will do is it will inform what you typically spend money on and how much you typically spend right now. That's going to give you a good estimate of what you can expect your spending to look like in the summer, though there will be some categories that change. So to track your income and expenses, we suggest keeping track of all transactions, whether they're from a debit card, a credit card, cash transactions, if you're using those right now. I also find it really helpful to track transactions from money transfer apps like Venmo or Cash App. You'll want to be intentional about identifying all of your income and expenses and then identifying categories within that so that you can assess what's going to remain the same in the summer versus what's going to change. If you know there will be some benefits to your summer opportunity, whether it's paid or unpaid, you still may have some non-financial benefits that come up. You may be able to narrow down your budget categories even more. So I think a good example of this would be if you have an opportunity that provides housing, or like entertainment or social opportunities that are provided through your internship. Those can sort of reduce some of the costs you might find yourself having throughout the summer. So as you're looking at your budget categories, think about those benefits that you have and how they will change what you're responsible for in the summer. So again, we're going to do a short activity just to brainstorm some of those differences together. So use the chat. And share what categories you have in your budget now and how they might change for the summer. Or think about categories you don't currently include in your budget, but you may need in the summer. So again, we'll pause for 30 seconds or so, so that you can share your thoughts through the chat. Any ideas? And if you have no idea, that's okay too. Jamil and I can talk about what we've experienced in the past as well. Okay, currently have rent, food, out to eat occasionally, birthday and holiday gifts. That's a great one that I feel like is often left out of budgets, even as someone who does like talks about budgeting for a living. I don't include that in my budget and I probably should. Summer, much the same, plus summer clothes. They get pricey. You are right. These things add up really quickly. Any other thoughts about what might change in the summer? Yes, this is a really, really great point. Thank you. Financial aid covers almost everything during the school year, but not the summer. That is one of the primary differences. It's completely up to you to figure out what's going on in the summer. Great. Yeah, so on that note, I think, there are a few expenses you might be responsible for during the academic year. So things like school supplies, unless you're, okay, someone said Penn summer savings expectation. That's a great point. And maybe we can talk a little bit more about how that fits in later on, because that's a really good point. But yeah, so during the year, you might have some like course specific expectations. So, if you do pay anything toward your student bill, That's something you won't have in the summer. You won't have school supplies, textbooks, etc. in the summer, but you might have new expenses. So like Victoria said in the chat, you know, having rent for the first time, especially if you mostly live on campus, or I think another common one that can come up is like paying for food. If you typically have a meal plan. I think it's important to just think about the resources that Penn usually provides and think about how you won't have those things in the summer. I think one other really great example is Paw Truck. If you tend to work out a lot, go to the gym a lot, you're not in Philly for the summer, you'll have to find some sort of alternative. I will say if you are in Philly for the summer, you do still have access to Paw Truck. So that's always a great resource as long as you're a student. Great. Anything I missed, Jamil, that you can think of? No? Good? All right. We will continue on then. So once you have a sense of your general habits now from tracking your income and looking at your current budget categories, it's time to estimate income. And this can be really challenging depending on your circumstances. So if you have a paid opportunity, this is going to entail making a list of whatever payment you're receiving. Again, this could be hourly pay. It could be a stipend of some sort for whatever period of weeks that your internship is lasting. And then, you know, to further complicate it, if you are receiving a stipend, you could receive it all at once. You could receive it in chunks throughout the summer. I think it's pretty common for stipends to be cut in half, for you to, you know, receive half of it at the beginning of the summer and then receive the other half later on, either at the midpoint or like closer to the end of your internship experience. Either way, you'll want to break up those big chunks into either monthly or weekly segments, depending on how you prefer to assess your budget. So if a monthly budget works for you, you'll want to split the amount between the months in which your internship takes place. And I think broadly, it technically comes out to around 3 months, though you're sort of working with half months because you might have like mid-May and then all of June, all of July, and then you might work until mid-August. So it kind of comes out to 3 months, but might not feel as, I don't know, book-ended as having it traditionally fit into those months perfectly might feel. Alternatively, it may feel beneficial to break it up into weekly amounts instead, so that you can sort of give yourself an allowance for each week. And that's a great question in the chat. How do I know whether a weekly or monthly budget works better for me? This is a really great question. And I think what it comes down to is how you conceptualize your spending. So for instance, like if you are paid on a weekly basis, I find it's much easier to budget on a weekly basis. And I say that because like it's easier to figure out how to segment it out better, I guess. So like if you're paid monthly, you have some larger chunk of money that you're responsible for the entire next month. You have to make it last. It's kind of similar to like receiving a student account refund. If you receive one of those at the start of the semester, and then somehow you have to make it last the entire semester. And if you don't create a plan in advance, you know, you might make mistakes. You might find yourself later in the semester not having enough to get through. If you often find yourself to be in those sorts of situations, it could be better to budget on a weekly basis instead, because you're sort of making yourself responsible for a shorter period of time. Hopefully that makes sense. If there's anything within that you think I should elaborate on, let me know. Jamil, if you have thoughts, feel free to jump in. But I think when you get paid weekly, which is like how most students at Penn get paid, it can be easier to think about it on a weekly basis, just because like that segmentation naturally occurs. Yeah. Okay. I see Jamil nodding. Thoughts?
The only other thing I would potentially add is, you know, in some of my experiences, I've been paid bi-weekly, so like 2 times a month. And it could be helpful to look at it as if it's in 2-week intervals, or, you know, if it's only once a month, just looking at your budget overall from the month standpoint. So I really think it's just dependent on when you are expecting to receive income. and like the frequency of that, because it just makes it much simpler to match your income and expenses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. Thanks for that. Thanks for the question. So we've discussed how to estimate income if you have a paid opportunity, which is fairly easy to do. If you have an unpaid or underpaid summer experience, it can be challenging to really estimate what your income is because you're not really receiving income. So what you want to do instead is think about what other funding options do you have available to you. So take note of any savings you have available for the summer or any funds you expect to receive from family. I will be completely transparent. Like we say those things, take note of savings, take note of other resources you may receive. When I was a student, I didn't have either of those things. Like I literally just had to wing it. But if you do have them, you want to know what those are, because you're going to want as many resources possible to support you throughout that time. So make sure you think really thoroughly about what's at your disposal, because that's going to provide you for the baseline that you need, so that you can determine how much money you'll request when you do apply for funding later, which we'll talk about a little bit later in this presentation. So the next step is to estimate expenses. And that's really what we're going to spend most of our time together talking about. For the most part, this step looks the same, whether you have a paid or unpaid opportunity for the summer, because you're trying to identify what are my responsibilities this summer? What am I expected to pay for? And what do I want to spend money on based on the things I want to do this summer? So you just want to get a sense of these responsibilities. And we have two main ways for you to think about your expenses. The first way to think about your expenses is in terms of fixed and variable expenses, which you may have heard them, referred to as this before. Generally, fixed expenses are ones that you'll incur them on a regular basis and typically of a predetermined standard amount. On the other hand, variable expenses are ones that fluctuate depending on your behavior. So fixed expenses might be, and I think Jamil said this earlier, fixed expenses are things like rent, subscriptions, stuff like that. Variable expenses are things that are really based on behavior. So your food costs, maybe clothes shopping. I'm positive there are any social costs you have, really, they're going to be variable depending on the choices that you make. It can be helpful to think about fixed versus variable because this helps you identify the exact amount you're spending each month in terms of your fixed expenses. So again, what are your financial responsibilities? How much should you anticipate spending each month? And the level of control you have over them. So by estimating fixed expenses, you have a baseline for the absolute minimum that you'll need every month throughout the summer. Fixed expenses are pretty hard to change in small ways, so they may be inflexible for the summer. Though, generally we would say if you can make changes to fixed expenses, those tend to have greater impact on your budget overall. So you can always assess if there are fixed things you can get rid of, things like subscriptions, etc. I don't know, whatever you have in your budget currently. So yeah, those are pretty hard to change in small ways, but variable expenses can change as a result of small behavior changes. This is really where you have the opportunity to be flexible with your budget. So when you write out your list of fixed and variable expenses, it'll be pretty easy to identify amounts for your fixed expenses because, again, you already incur these on a regular basis. You can expect them. You sort of know what you're expected to pay. But you'll need to make estimates for your variable expenses. And I think there are a few ways you can do that. So one is to reflect on your current habits. So again, think back to step one when you tracked your income and expenses. Reflect on those habits and identify typical spending amounts on categories. And again, keep in mind that it could change in the summer. If you're around different people, your behavior might change. Whatever the case is, it could change a little bit, but you probably have some sort of standard of living that you're used to, that you'll maintain to some degree throughout the summer, no matter your funding source. And then if there are new categories that you're adding, So someone asked earlier, how do I anticipate housing costs if I haven't lived off campus, stuff like that. We will talk about that shortly, but most likely what you need to do is do some research into typical cost of those expenses in the area that you're going to live in. So you can usually do a quick Google search of cost of living in insert city here. I think a lot of students end up going to New York. Many students end up in the Bay Area. You may end up in a place like Chicago, something like that. You can Google cost of living in those places and find what you're looking for, especially when it comes to things like housing, groceries, general cost of living things. That's going to be your best bet to make estimates for those things you've never experienced before. The other way to conceptualize your expenses is in terms of needs and wants. Those terms are pretty self-explanatory, but needs are items that you absolutely cannot live without. And wants are items that are not necessary, but may make life more pleasant. So you still want to make room for them in your budget, but you may limit them to some degree. It can be helpful to organize your expenses into these categories in order to better understand your financial priorities and where you should allocate your money first. Especially if you have limited funds for the summer or are applying to receive more money, you're going to have to be real with yourself about what's most important to have in the summer and what's not important. And one thing we want to point out about, thinking about needs and wants is that they're not always dichotomous. It'd be real easy if they were. It'd be really great because it would just make things so much easier. We wouldn't have to make decisions about what we care about more. So let's do a short activity just to demonstrate this.
Yeah, so if you all wouldn't mind just taking a look at the items on this list and just think, do you think these are needs or wants? And if you want, you can explain in the chat, but I'll give folks a couple minutes, 30 seconds actually, to type out your response, and then we can kind of walk through each of these and discuss. So I'm seeing in the chat, rent is definitely a necessity. And food, it's definitely a need to buy groceries, but potentially maybe eating out and trying fancier restaurants and fancier foods may be more of a want. That's definitely good. Clothing, definitely a need for basics for sure. Yeah. So as the rest of those come in, that's a good point. Like what we really want to highlight here is that for sure, rent and utilities and such are definitely needs, and there may be some discretion as far as whether or not food, clothing, and social activities are needs. But at the end of the day, it really is going to depend on you and your situation. And it's also important just to realize, while we could say blanketly like a social activity may be a want, it's good for your mental and physical health to prioritize, social activities or social interactions of some sort. So there really is an argument for each of these being needs. And again, it's just dependent on your individual situation and how you're thinking about your budget generally and, your behaviors. Lindsay, is there anything you want to add there?
No, I think you covered it for the most part. I would also argue occasionally rent is also a want. So I'd say when it comes, depending on where you're going to be located for the summer, I think we really discount this idea that like living with family is an option depending on where you are. I think it can feel kind of embarrassing at times, but like if that's the best way for you to save money, sometimes that can be the best choice for you. So yeah, all of these can be needs or wants. I think everyone in the chat had really great points. So I think we can continue on. Thanks.
Great. So we've mentioned a few times that you may experience costs in the summer that you don't typically have. We discussed them briefly earlier when we talked about budget categories. but we want to highlight how you can estimate values for some of these costs and what aspects you should be sure to consider. So for housing, and in response to the question that was asked earlier, a good rule of thumb is housing should be no more than 30% of your income or your pay. So if you have a paid opportunity, this should be fairly easy to estimate. Though if you have limited costs other than housing, so just not a lot of other, I guess you could say, fixed costs other than housing, you may be able to stomach a little bit more than 30% for your rent. However, if you have an unpaid opportunity, again, you'll want to do research into what typical housing costs are in your area, and then look specifically for sublets or opportunities around that. And whatever community you end up in, you should be able to find some sort of Facebook group for people who are subletting their places. So that may be an option to find cheap housing as well. And when you're estimating housing costs, don't forget that it may involve more than just rent. So, you should be sure to find out what utilities you may be responsible for, Wi-Fi, water, gas, trash. And then as far as transportation, you really want to identify all your options. So, I'm from Atlanta, and I had an internship last year working at a startup in Atlanta. So for me, my main cost was just the gas costs and driving my car. We don't really have public transportation that's built out well, like in the Northeast. So you really just want to identify all your options, public transit, walking, driving, and then make an estimate as to how much each reasonable option will cost, and determine based on costs and convenience which option you think you'll stick with for the summer. And it can change while you're in your internship or living during the summer. But you really just want to try to give yourself some wiggle room, because again, things may not always go according to plan. And then as far as general relocation, depending on if you have a virtual, given COVID, or an in-person opportunity, this could look different. So if you're planning to relocate from your current home or from Philly for the summer, make sure to consider the travel costs to getting to that new city, as well as the cost of moving your items from one place to another. So if it's New York, it may be a bit cheaper than if you have to move across the country to LA from Philly. But just you want to be aware of those costs and how they're going to be factored in. So then other expenses that you'll probably have, but they're very general to your current budget, are food costs, social costs, entertainment costs, and just other personal, miscellaneous costs. And when you're looking at these expenses, you want to keep in mind for things like social and entertainment that if you're applying for funding from a PEN resource, you most likely won't receive money for these expenses. Most of PEN's summer funding sources are dedicated to helping you with what you, I guess you could say, need for the summer. You may need to dip into your savings for these types of costs. That being said, you'll still want to create a plan for how much you intend to spend in these areas to adequately, prepare for your budget and spending overall. And then I would just say, you really should plan for fun when you're looking at these general expenses. It's idealistic to think that, we will create a rigid budget and really stick to it, because things can change and you deserve nice things. You work really hard, and you obviously care a lot about, the things that you're involved in. So it's okay, if every once in a while for one specific opportunity that you decide to do something nice, with friends or for yourself. So you should really give yourself the room in your budget to socialize in a financially a reasonable way. And then just briefly before I get to the questions in the chat, the last thing I'd say is, you should say no if necessary. That is, just be mindful of times you're choosing to eat out or choosing to spend money on other things beyond what you've already, budgeted for. And potentially, like, you could suggest alternatives that are more financially sensitive or just, financially reasonable to any new friends or, the people that you're you're hanging out with. So just looking at the chat here, we got a question. What categories does Penn consider a need then? I would pass this to Lindsay just because I feel like she might be in better position to answer this.
Yeah, so this is a really great question. And really, I mean, this is the entire point of our presentation today is, you know, to talk about you have all of these things that you may pay for. And really what you need comes down to how you justify it. So like one person asked, does it include groceries? Well, like you literally need to eat to survive, right? So like if you need money to pay for groceries because you have an unpaid opportunity this summer, like that certainly qualifies as something that you can justify when you're, you know, applying for this funding, filling out the mock budget, whatever it may be. The whole point of the application process is they want to see that you have thought critically about what's most important for your survival this summer, basically. That is why these funding sources exist, is to make sure that you can pursue opportunities that are meaningful to you for your personal growth, for your professional development, and that you can, you know, survive during this time. So keep in mind, that's literally the reason behind the existence of these funding options. Now, the question that was posed after that, do they typically meet your need? This is complicated and it depends on the funding source that you're applying to. So it's really important to keep in mind that funding for the summer is not the same as financial aid. So the reason you receive financial aid is because there are needs that you will have to complete your education at Penn, right? So there is a cost of attendance that includes, you know, expenses that are billed to students directly and expenses that are unbilled, but that, you know, you're expected to have come up at some point. So things like books, food is another one if you don't have a meal plan. And the financial aid policy is that that need is met. When it comes to the summer, you are basically indicating to whatever funding source that, you know, you could really use some help with having money for the summer so that you can pursue this opportunity that's really meaningful to you. So it comes down to the availability of the funding, how many other applicants there are, you know, what's the option. So it's hard to give a yes or no answer about do they typically meet your need, because like I don't know. I guess what I'm saying is it comes down to whoever is reviewing the applications and their judgment, right? So again, when it comes to things like you need a place to live, like you can't just be homeless for the summer, right? Like Penn would not be comfortable with that. Like if you literally have no option, you are likely going to get some help with that as long as you were able to explain like why you need the help with that. I guess just to give an example, though, I don't want my example to like scare people away from applying to these things, because also, and we'll talk about this a little bit when we talk about the actual funding sources, so much has changed since when I was a student. Like now highly aided students are eligible for up to $4,000 of funding every summer. Well, 2 of your summers at Penn, I should say. And Career Services has a lot of funding this year for students who don't qualify for that highly aided category. And if you have questions about that funding, we're not necessarily experts, but we can direct you to folks who can answer questions about the Career Services funding. But my story is that when I was a student, I think this was my sophomore year, like summer after sophomore year going into junior year, I was going home for the summer. I'm originally from Kansas City, Missouri, but I was taking an unpaid research opportunity at a local university. And basically my problem was I had no money. If I were going home, like my family couldn't really support me. So for the most part, at least, like for some of my needs, transportation, things like that. So I needed help with that. And so I applied for funding through Career Services. But at the time, their funding program wasn't super well funded. They didn't have a lot of donors. Like they were only able to fund about like 20 to 30 students a year. Now, again, I don't want this to scare you. They can fund way more students than that this year. I can send you the DP article about the amount of funding that they have for this year. But I was denied. And I think the primary reason why was because I was going home. I had a place to stay. Like, my costs were relatively low. I think I applied for literally like $1,000 for the summer, because I just needed to be able to support myself when it came to those specific costs. So even though I didn't get that funding, I reached out to a staff member that I knew and I was like, do you know of any other opportunities? And I was able to get a grant through another resource because I reached out to that individual and they knew of some other options. But my point is, it comes down to justification and, how many other students are in a similar situation. I hope that answered your question and I didn't just like ramble for 10 minutes about my own experience, but it really does vary. And that's why we're even having this workshop at all, is to share that like it comes down to, your own self-awareness about what you need to get through the summer. Thank you. I'm so glad that was helpful. Okay, I'm going to stop talking now and hand it back to Jamil to talk about setting boundaries.
Thank you, Lindsay. So yeah, if you all recall, again, in our general approach to budgeting, the 6-step process, the 5th step after estimating and all the other things is setting boundaries. So usually we would say that setting boundaries is optional and depends on what you're hoping to achieve with budgeting. That still is the case. But when you're planning for the summer, you're going to use this step to identify the difference between the resources you have and the difference and the resources you need. So this is where you can identify how much you need to apply for and how you plan to justify it, similar to what we were just speaking about. So keep in mind those concepts of fixed versus variable and needs versus wants to help determine what to ask for. And with that, you can decide whether to set boundaries for yourself with regard to specific cost categories, such as food costs. And that is, you can just be deliberate as to when you eat out versus when you cook at home. And with that, I'll pass it back to Lindsay, I know, to cover ways to apply for funding at Penn.
Great. Yeah, so we just talked about this a little bit. So if you find yourself needing to apply for funding, there are a variety of resources from Penn, some of which I just mentioned. So I will say we are not experts on how these resources work, but we want you to know that they're available. And actually, recently, Penn First Plus put together a really great newsletter that sort of outlines all of these funding resources with videos from staff from these offices talking about it. This is something we collaborated on in preparation for this workshop. So there's a link at the bottom, and I'm going to ask Jamil to put the direct link in the chat. That way you can click on it. It just sort of explains the funding for like how the funding works for each of these resources. So again, if you're a highly aided student, you can apply for the highly aided summer funding, which again is up to $4,000 in the summer. Career Services has a lot more funding this year, and there are, I'm not going to pretend I know the dates off the top of my head, but there are like 3 funding cycles. So I think the first due date already passed. I'm pretty sure the next due date is next Sunday, which I believe is the 28th of March. And then the third due date should be sometime in April. Curve has funding if you are doing a research opportunity this summer, and then Penn Global if you have a global experience. I think all of their funding comes through the programs they already offer. But again, if you look at that link that Jamil just dropped in the chat, you'll get more information about how that actually works. So then the last step of the budgeting process, it happens throughout the summer. So anytime you budget, you'll want to reflect regularly and adjust as needed. So as your priorities and habits change throughout the summer, you'll be able to make adjustments to your budget to adapt to your new needs. So just make sure you can continue to meet your general financial obligations as you make whatever changes you make. Okay, so that's really the content for today's workshop. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to stop the recording because this is really your chance to get more specific